Good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us and welcome to the first of many MARI Mothers Against Racism and Injustice Community Outreach webinar series. Our mission at MARI's is to identify and share resources focused on anti-racism that are tailored to educators, parents, students, and youth within our community. We encourage you to use the resources in tandem that we will be sharing tonight with those you already may have in your personal and in your professional network. Today, we look forward and are very pleased to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Leslie Richard. But first, before we do that, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping rules. First, please make sure that your microphone is set to mute, and please ensure that your camera is set to off. Questions to the panelists should only be submitted via the Q&A feature in Zoom. The questions are going to be collected throughout the presentation, and they'll be answered at the end of the keynote speaker's presentation. So don't worry, we've left enough time to make sure that we can answer all of your questions. MARI will also host a raffle for all participants. Details will follow at the end of today's presentation. So who we are. So before I hand it over to Dr. Richard, I just wanted to share a brief introduction to MARI for those who may not be familiar with our mission. Mothers Against Racism and Injustice looks to serve as a liaison in your personal learning as well as a resource for anti-racism throughout the following three core action areas. The first is to serve as a resource for anti-racism through public education, through webinars like we're hosting tonight, as well as other forms of public outreach. Also, a development of a youth ambassador program, because as we know, youth are our future. And also influencing change and having an impact on our school curriculum, because we know many of our students and our children spend the majority of their time in school. We also highly encourage you to follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, you can find us on Instagram, and also on our website at MARI in Action. And of course, as a nonprofit group, if you feel the need, please donate to, it should be 2020 MARI at 44-321. And so with that, I'd like to introduce you to our keynote speaker and a very good friend of mine. I'm sorry, do donate to end racism to 44-321. Text that word. I'm going to introduce you to my dear friend and to someone who we're very pleased to share with you tonight, Dr. Leslie Richard. She is a pediatrician who has a specialty in developmental and behavioral pediatrics. She's been practicing in Pasadena and the greater Los Angeles area for over 21 years. She maintains an affiliation with Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, and she is specifically trained to meet the unique needs of children throughout their entire developmental stages as they grow and as they mature. Dr. Richard will be focusing on the framework of racism, bullying, and trauma. She'll walk us through a discussion of microaggressions children and teens face on the playground, in the classroom, and on the court. A discussion on recognition, mitigation, and coping. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Leslie Richard. Thank you, Leslie.
Hey, thank you, Noemi. I'm happy to see all of you, even though I can't see any of you. So just bear with me if it looks like I'm talking into space. I'm very honored to be asked to speak on this topic. I have had a lot of experience dealing with children with developmental disabilities, as well as children with mental health problems. And as we know, often those children actually experience overt aggression and not only microaggressions. So children experiencing trauma due to the actions of others is something I've been a witness to and a part of helping to mitigate really since I was a little child. I'll tell you something about myself. I have grown up in the Pasadena area. I was born and raised here. I grew up with a brother who was born with autism spectrum disorder, which is the nice word that's used nowadays, but back then it was called childhood schizophrenia, and saw a lot of aggression that was directed in his direction. I attended private schools and public schools in the Pasadena area with very many diverse sorts of teaching philosophies and methods. I went to Pacific Oaks for preschool. I went to Jackson for elementary for kindergarten. I went to Sequoia School, which was a very progressive liberal school in the 60s for most of my elementary years. Then I went to public school for a couple of years in junior high, and then I ended up my secondary education at Westridge School for Girls. So I grew up with a lot of different viewpoints and experiences that have to do with all kinds of issues that we're going to be talking about today. That prompted my interest, I believe, especially growing up with a brother with autism, to become involved in activities and professions that would benefit all children. I've worked in homes before becoming a doctor for children who were in the foster care system. I have did a children's program in a battered women's shelter before I went to college. I've done a lot of work with children and individuals with developmental disabilities. Just to give you a little bit of my background, my biggest claim to fame is that I have 4 children, ranging in age from 18 to 30. And so everything I learned in school and residency and all those places gave me no help whatsoever. Because when you have to do it for real, it's very, very different. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about microaggressions, which I think is a very interesting word. When I first heard it a few years ago, interestingly, if you look it up on Merriam-Webster, there is a quote that's given, actually from a family member of mine who I didn't know was even in the dictionary, a little niece of mine, who talked about the fact that a lot of experiences that people have interacting with each other can be subtly aggressive, even though they are not overtly presented as aggressions. And we see this, since we are talking today about race and about some other things, we see this especially really starting very early on and throughout childhood and adulthood in our society. But, you know, I know we're in a very sort of tumultuous political time, as well as a scary time in terms of illness and, you know, COVID and all these things. But these discussions and issues really started a long time ago. They're kind of at the forefront now. And I really commend Mari for taking this on. I think that a lot of change we see with children especially starts with parents and educators. So being here with you is really an honor, and I commend you for taking this on.
And Leslie, can I, Dr. Richard, so
Yes.
can I interrupt you just to get, I apologize. I wanted to get an idea of who is with us today. So I wanted
Okay.
to pull up a few polling slides, just so you have a better idea of who's listening
Okay.
and on the webinar,
Perfect.
since you can't see
Perfect.
everyone's faces.
Okay.
So let's put up the first polling slide. So who has joined us today? Can you tell me if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're a student, or just an individual, interested individual? So about 30 seconds to mark that. Okay, I'm going to close the slide and let's see the results. So it looks like the majority that we have with us today are parents, then teachers, and then students. Great. So welcome, parents. Our next polling question is, who has a child who has experienced or knows of someone, or you yourself have experienced a microaggression? Leave it open for a couple of more seconds. Okay, let's close this poll and see the results. So as you see, the majority of us have, so this is a very timely subject. Another polling question. Have you or anyone in your family been a perpetrator of a microaggression? A couple more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll. See the results? No, so some have not. And then our last polling question. Who has sought professional help for challenges related to microaggressions? Okay, let's close the poll. Looks like we have some who have, majority have not. Okay, this is great. We just wanted to get an idea as Dr. Richard moves into our presentation. So thank you for participating. Go ahead, Dr. Richard.
Thank you. So I always start off my presentations with a little bit of personal information or personal stories or stories I've heard, just because it makes it more real to everyone. And so I want to tell you my first experience with microaggression that I perpetrated on another person. I used to work at a swimming pool when I was in college in the summers over in Sunland, which was a largely Latino community. And I was the person who took in the money for the pool. And there was a little boy who was lost, about 3 years old. And I've always loved children. My whole family, my father was a pediatrician. My mom was an educator. My aunt's an educator. We all love kids. So I pick up this little boy and I put him up on my high stool. And I start speaking to him in my broken Spanish, like donde su mama and all these things in Spanish. And he's just looking at me and he starts turning his head like a puppy. He starts turning his head like, what are you talking about? And he goes, my name is, Eduardo, like my mom's over there. And I thought, oh, I just assumed because I was in La Puente, basically, Summerlin, and thinking that, this kid didn't speak English, not that one way or the other, he could have spoke Spanish or English, but I made an assumption about him instead of asking him. And I don't know that I'd call that a microaggression, but I think the thing that people don't realize when we're talking about microaggressions is that they are often comments or actions that are very subtle, and they unconsciously or unintentionally express a prejudiced attitude toward a member of a marginalized group. So it may not be racial at all. One thing could be related to race, like skin color. Oh, you're so pretty for a dark-skinned girl. Or, oh, when I went to Westridge, I was told, oh, you're not like those other Black people. You're smart. Other people can be marginalized. I know blonde girls are always assumed, or, I've seen them have been assumed that they're not so bright or that they're overly sexualized. So often, though, these actions and comments are very subtle. And the behavior of the speech is often characterized by comments or actions. So it could be, hey, everybody who's got their hair in 2 long ponytails, let's sit over at this bench. Or only the boys who have an afro today can come and play basketball. So the power of microaggressions lies in the sort of invisibility to the perpetrator. So the person who is sort of expressing this sentiment to another person typically finds it difficult to believe that he or she possesses biased attitudes. In a little while, I'm going to challenge that a little bit, but often, I remember being at Westridge and being told I was obsessed with the topic. Some things that some of you may have heard or may have even said. You're pretty for a Black girl. Your eyes are so pretty because they are green. And this isn't just true for African American girls. This is kind of true for really all ethnicities, that our standard of beauty and what is typically the norm in the US is sort of a Nordic version of a male individual. So blonde haired, blue eyed, fair skinned, thin facial features. It's interesting because a long time ago, when Italians and Irish first immigrated to the US, they were seen as sort of lesser than or a minority. So there's been this sort of standard by which most individuals, I won't say necessarily around the world, but in this country have been judged and treated. The issue with microaggression is the whole issue of the invisibility to the perpetrator, supposedly. And usually that person finds it very difficult to believe that he or she possesses biased attitudes. which means that it's very hard for these things to be overcome because it's kind of like the person, I don't know if you've had an argument with a sibling or somebody who's even a friend, they're just like, what? And you're like, wait, what do you mean what? You just called me XYZ, and they're like, oh, you're so sensitive. That happened a lot, I think, in on the playground, on the workspace, on the basketball court, for children, adolescents, young adults, and adults. This isn't just something, even though I know I'm talking to parents and mostly moms, this isn't an issue that's just experienced by children. Next slide, please. I guess, am I doing the slides or are you? Okay, so what I like to do, and I used to have a lot of discussion about this when I was younger, is what's the difference in prejudice and racism? So prejudice is basically a bias or a preconceived opinion, idea, or belief about something. A prejudice can be positive. I'm prejudiced against people who, are skin divers, and I think they're braver than anybody I know because I'm scared of sharks, and that's not a lie. But other people find that many prejudices are actually negative. So they often refer to unfair or strongly held negative judgments, especially hostile judgments about certain people. So a person can be prejudiced against little people, against disabled people, against people of color, against tall people, against lawyers. It's basically saying that we have a prejudgment that can be positive or negative, but often is based on our own judgment rather than facts. This is different than actual definition of racism. You can go to the next slide, please. So racism, and I like that, so this is from Merriam-Webster that has actually been dictionary that's been updated recently. And when I was in college back in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of argument and discussion about what racism is. And racism is a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Additionally, systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another is what we call racism. So it's the execution in actions, in beliefs, in laws, in ways that people interact that are based on human traits that actually usually are not changeable. So a person is born into this world and sort of classified to a specific group based on certain human traits. Now, there's a lot of argument in biology, and I'm a physician, and I love biology, but I'm not going to go into a lot of it now. But in human biology, whether or not race really truly exists, that's an interesting thing to think about. Like, are we really all the same biologically and genetically? Over time, because our groups have migrated in different parts of the world and experienced different conditions, some of our genetics have changed for that reason. That's why we have dark-skinned people and light-skinned people and blonde-haired people and blue-eyed people and dark-haired people, based on really how close or far away they are or were from the equator and where they migrated. We all started out the same color. So interestingly, racism has been something that has been created by humans to differentiate power structures, is the way I kind of look at it. If you look at 2A, once again, about the definition, it's the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. This is different than prejudice, which we just talked about before. Prejudice is saying that we all, or some of us, may have preconceived notions about certain people based on external factors. And that doesn't have to be negative. I love Italian food. So whenever I make a new Italian friend, I'm like, oh, great, you must be a good cook. And the person's like, no, sorry, I can't cook at all. I mean, maybe I'm making an assumption about them, but it is a prejudgment but it's not one that has to do with my superiority or their inferiority. It's a prejudgment, and that is a prejudice. A prejudice can be positive or prejudice can be negative. Racism has the undercurrent of the belief that one group of people versus others is inherently superior to the other based on the color of their skin and certain other attributes. Next slide. So really, when we talk about racism, we're talking about 3 levels of racism. And I took a lot of this information. As many of you know, I'm a developmental behavioral pediatrician, which means I trained in general pediatrics, actually at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And then I went on for further training in what's called developmental behavioral pediatrics. And that means that a lot of my reading and my information has to do with the health determinants, as well as the social and emotional and societal determinants of health. So there are 3 levels of racism that we're really looking at when we talk about racism, especially as it affects children. So there's structural or institutional racism, which many of us are aware of. We can look at our school systems, we can look at our court systems, we can look at the laws that have been created, we can look at all kinds of things in the structural makeup of our society and other societies, and basically what certain people are have the opportunity to access and what others don't, based on the color of their skin or other attributes. We're not going to talk a lot today about structural or institutional racism. There's personally mediated racism, which is where differential treatment is given to individuals based on assumptions of one's abilities, motives, or intents. And then the third level of racism is really what I think of as self-imposed, where a lot of stereotypes or ways of being treated or sense of efficacy and power is internalized based on stereotypes that many have experienced, not only for in their own lives, but also generationally. So I know many of you are aware of the term generational trauma. That's something that's spoken about a lot, not just in terms of race, but in terms of experiences. If you think of the Holocaust, if you think of the Rwandan genocide, if you think of what's happened to in Persia, in Cuba, in Armenia, there are all kinds of ways people have been treated differently because of ethnicity. But the internalization of a lot of those attributes that are attributed to people who are deemed as inferior really become internalized and become part of the person's identity and undermine their confidence, their self-esteem, as well as their mental health. Next slide, please. So what is a marginalized group? So when we recognize microaggressions, one of the things we look at, and I don't know if I read in the beginning the definition of microaggression, but often we're talking about marginalized groups. So in the US, it's interesting to even think of who a marginalized group would be, since so many people have been coming here for hundreds and hundreds of years and are still considered to be marginalized. So the first thing this talk, I think, is important to sort of explore is, what is microaggression? How do we recognize it? And who are marginalized groups? Most of us have a little toe somewhere in some marginalized group, whether our parents were immigrants from some country in Europe and were not accepted here, whether our families had to flee persecution somewhere else, whether or not we grew up on a farm or we grew up in poverty, whether or not our ancestors were slaves. All of us could in some way, we've talked about America as the melting pot. So many of us in this country have been marginalized at some point in its history. Okay, next slide, please. The issue with marginalization is, what have we determined to be what is the norm? What's the standard of what is human. I'm going to say that again. It's not what's the norm and what is standard in the US or in the in the Ukraine or in Korea. It's what are the things that we classify as being different and other. Now, being a scientist and having my my major in college, I went to Stanford University and majored in human biology, which really looked at evolution and sort of the evolving of how humans interact and define each other and progress. And so the idea of other has always been part of the human and sort of animal experience. However, the meaning of other and the ranking of other is a later phenomenon. So the things that I'm going to come back to our country, that have really been put sort of in the other pile are people who are another race. Gender can be looked at as other if you are female or male. Sexual orientation can be an other. Religious affiliation can be an other. Mostly the history in the US has been of Protestant Christian religion. Catholicism was, not embraced. Islam was not embraced. Not that these things are embraced now, but they were even persecuted in the beginning of our country's time. Socioeconomic level can be something that is seen as different or other. Differently abled. I show this picture of this little girl who has Rett syndrome, this is a disability where a child is born typically developing, and over the next maybe 18 months to 3 years loses the ability to speak, develops some very autistic-like characteristics, often cannot walk or talk, and really is a child who basically is disappearing in front of their parents' eyes. Differently abled or disabled children and adults are seen as other. Family structure, the single parent, or the family structure that is different today. And also ideas of beauty. Who's beautiful? Your eyes are so pretty because they're green, or all kinds of things. My daughter wrote an excellent article, I believe, when she was at USC. It's called "You're Pretty for a Black Girl." And I think she's beautiful, just beautiful, period. But she kept getting that feedback at USC. Oh, you're so pretty for a Black girl. What does that say? So the whole idea of what is the norm is something we need to be challenging in our own homes, as well as with other people when they impose what they view as the norm, especially now. Next slide, please. So microaggressions, what are they? So microaggressions, and I won't go all the way back to the original slide, but the word micro kind of gets to me. So a microaggression is supposedly something that is minor. Oh, I love it when you wear your hair straight. Last week you had a curly, but it's so much cuter when you wear it straight. Or, oh, I didn't know Black girls could swim like you can swim. Oh, you're so quiet for a Cuban. All my aunts are so loud. How did you end up being so quiet? One of my best friends to this day, luckily she's not on this call, never forget, I've always been a chunky girl, then a voluptuous girl, then a chunky girl, all my life. And I was at one of my more less chunky times, and she was so happy. And she's like, I've always loved you, but I really love you when you're so thin and we can go do, and I was just like, really? Did you just say that? So, microaggressions don't only happen from people who are sort of out to get you. They can happen from your own family members, but they're sort of actions that are based on prejudgments and values. Like, what do we really value? And then what do we view as normative? So interestingly, I like to tell personal stories a little bit. It just makes things a little more interesting. In one of my times when I'd lost a lot of weight, my children were both going to so a private school, you know, I won't say which one, but my kids have been all over this place, private schools, and so have I. And then we were also playing basketball with the Brotherhood Crusade, and I had lost some weight. And so when I would go to the normative school where my kids went to school, which was a private school, all these moms are just like, oh, you look so great. It's so great that you're doing this. How much more are you going to lose? Like, how much more? And I'd go to the basketball practices with my kids over, kind of, the Brotherhood Crusade. And people are like, girl, you're going to lose too much weight. You're getting too skinny. You better stop. It's just, you better stop. So what is normal to us? But what do we say? And what are we conveying to people? Are these active acts of aggression? Are they micro? But what we do is we are basically in our expressions relaying what our values are and ideas about what we cherish and what we disdain. So, people talking about what your kids eat, or they notice that you give them cookies in their lunch, or little things that seem little, but over time, when you're the recipient, it's no longer micro. And inherent in these sort of microaggressions, whether they're comments, compliments even can be microaggressions. Like my friend saying, oh, I love it when you can shop, we can just go anywhere. And basically, she was saying, you don't have to try anything on, and we can go to the garment district, which is where we used to shop. But inherent in those kind of messages is, I'm okay and you're not. And these things happen on the playground. They happen on the court. They happen in church. They happen in the classroom. But what I think people don't understand, especially if you're someone who is somehow on the fringes, whether that's due to race, gender, sexual orientation, or not even necessarily orientation, but even sort of the way a person expresses their gender, okay? Some of those things can't even be helped if a person wanted to. So, I remember in elementary school, there was a guy we used to call Sweet Tyrone, so all the judgments and the messaging that says, I'm okay and you are not. And one of my big things is many of these things are perpetuated by parents. So the messaging in words and actions, I remember when I was in the 6th grade, the first person, and I went to a lot of liberal schools, liberal parents, and this mom just could not get her hands out of my afro. And I went to spend the night at her house. Interestingly, now here's the dynamic. I grew up, you got the socioeconomic stuff that goes on. I grew up where my father was a physician, and I went to private school, and I had this huge afro because that was the time I was expressing myself. It was in the early 70s. This family I went to, the mom was single, lived in a one-room place with her daughter. My parents let me sleep over there. But there was this weird power dynamic that she somehow had the right to just keep bothering my hair because it was different to her. And I just didn't feel comfortable saying stop, even though socioeconomically we were in very different places. And so the message there was very uncomfortable for me when I was younger, because I remember, like, why won't this woman get out of my hair? Is that a microaggression? Is that a fascination? But these are things that are very difficult to navigate for children, especially. Looking at these pictures here, being called an alien, it's like saying you're from Mars or something. An African-American girl or boy saying you don't talk like you're Black. I've always had thick eyebrows and hair all over my face, so I was always said to be Puerto Rican. And I could not convince people sometimes I wasn't Puerto Rican. I had nothing wrong with being Puerto Rican, but I'm not Puerto Rican. But so a lot of messaging to us from people in our own culture, in our own families, as well as other, are sort of giving us messaging in these microaggressions, because the word aggression is in there, that we're not okay. So next slide, please. So a little hurts a lot. And I'm going to give you some examples before we go on with how a little hurts a lot, because I think recognizing is a big thing. So I wrote down some things that I've just seen, experienced in friends, family, people I know, many of you. So I told you my story about speaking all this Spanish to the little boy at the pool, me assuming that he was a Spanish speaker. Most of the people at the pool were, but that I should have asked him what he spoke. I think that I'm going to tell you a big one in a minute, but I think, people assume that all Black people have rhythm, that all Latino people speak Spanish, that all Asians are smart and brilliant, that all Caucasian people are prejudiced or racist or don't think about anybody but their own perspective. So we all have these ideas about how other people think, behave, live. But the problem is we don't interact with each other enough to really change a lot of these assumptions, I think. So here's some things that, as I said, you're pretty for a Black girl. Your eyes are so pretty because they're green. Oh, you got good hair. Oh, you could pass for white. You're Black and you ain't got no rhythm. You got into Duke because you are Black. You got into Stanford because you were Black. You're a Mexican and you don't speak Spanish? Now, this was a big one for me, okay? You're angry because, you're a Black woman. You're just angry. Just get over it. You're just angry. Friends of my kids my daughter, one of her best friends is Korean, who was heartbroken when everybody assumed that she was a straight A student and that's all she cared about was grades. And she was actually a very creative, artistic, smart girl, but her focus wasn't, only on grades. So all the assumptions that are made are harmful. But one of the ones that really hurt me the most and actually made me change a job was when we were being overworked by a HMO that I worked at way before I became a developmental behavioral pediatrician. We were asked to see a patient every 5 minutes. I'm not kidding. And so I'd have 30 patients, pediatric patients in a day. And it was impossible to keep up. They didn't want us to send people to the urgent care. And I just was getting burnt out. And the director had a talk with myself and someone else about how we can change things. And basically, how can you see that many patients in 5 minutes and not have anybody complain, which is impossible. And she said, do you think that you're upset right now because you're Black and you feel picked on? And I don't think I've ever come more close to losing it with someone when it had never once crossed my mind, not once, that anything we were talking about had to do with my race. And I was upset because I felt like I can't see patients every 5 minutes and be a good doctor. But I just got so angry because I felt like, why does it always come back to that? So I think that we have to recognize when we are using race, a little hurts a lot. This person could not believe why I got so upset. I've never lost it like this professionally as I have. Luckily, we're at a restaurant. I walked out of the restaurant. I went into my car. This is before cell phones. I found the payphone in the pharmacy on the first floor. I called my husband. I told him what happened. And he said, quit. Because basically, it was clear to me that I was not being seen for anything else but sort of an angry Black woman who couldn't accept that I was really being treated like, a workhorse. And the person above me could not accept the fact that really, really, really was an egregious statement for her to make. And so recognizing when there is microaggression as well as overt aggression. And I think this is important both for us in terms of recognizing when we're on the recipient end, but also when we're on the delivering end. That's why I like to ask the survey in the beginning about how many people have actually perpetrated a microaggression. I had a very, very, really, I think one of the most profound things said to me when I was applying to medical school, and I had been a research assistant for this physician, Dr. David K. Stevenson. I'll never forget him. He was white, pasty white, like, he was just probably from Nebraska or somewhere. And he said to me, I had asked him to write my recommendation for medical school. And when I went to pick it up, sealed and everything, he took me aside and said, look, I want to tell you something. And I said, what? He said, if you ever feel like you are being treated differently, thought of as less smart, thought of as less hardworking, thought of as not as worthy of being a doctor. If you ever feel that, you are not imagining it. And that was the best thing he could ever say to me, because he said, you're not crazy. And I think what microaggression does is it makes the recipient feel like they are somehow to blame, or there's some weird thinking that they have, or they're somehow overreacting. And sometimes when it's pointed out to the person who's putting that forth, that is the message that they get. So that's where I want to go a little bit further in a couple slides and talk about what is aggression as compared to microaggression. So the thing that Dr. David Stevenson said to me that helped was that he was a person of the normative culture. He was male and he was Caucasian. And he told me, you're not imagining this. And that helped me get through it every time it happened, because I at least didn't have to think I was crazy. And this is the thing I think that we have to help our children with, who either are experiencing it or are perpetrating it, even if unintentionally. So the first thing is, do I ignore difference? The answer is no. When we ignore difference, when we say everybody's the same, I don't notice your curly hair, I don't notice your green eyes, I don't notice the fact that you have 10 braids, or that you have dreadlocks, or that you wear special, you bring interesting food to school. That's basically ignoring the person. It's, there's nothing wrong with difference. The problem is when value is ascribed to difference, and not just value, but value of superiority and inferiority that's based on arbitrary things. My daughter did a summer program in Spain when she was in the 12th grade, 11th to 12th grade. And she wrote her college essay about finally not having assumptions made about her race. She was in Spain. They called her the little negrita, the little black girl. In fact, one time I called to track her down because she never called her mom. And they go, oh yes, Jordan, the little negrita, the little black girl. She was called the little black girl. That wasn't a problem to her. What they didn't do, which happens to her here all the time, is they didn't assume she liked rap music. They didn't start talking to her in slang. They didn't assume that she had no awareness of anything that wasn't Black. They treated her like she was the individual that she was, recognizing that at the same time, yes, she has brown skin. Yes, her hair is a different texture. When we ignore difference, we're also in a way negating it and somehow saying that it's not of value. So we're not talking about ignoring. We're talking about having value for difference. So is intentional lack of exposure okay? Or should we explore each other? I've been in several schools, and I better watch my time. Of course, I don't have a timer on my computer while I'm looking here, but I'll look at my clock.
Leslie, you have about 15 more minutes.
Okay, I'm good then. So some slides I'm focusing on more than others. So should you invite a kid over to a play date, or a family over who's different than you, that you may not share food with or language with? Should you have that person over? Should we be more intentional? That was very 60s like. one of my kids went to Pacific Oaks, and we came in about 3 weeks after the school year had started. She was 3. There was another African-American kid at the table, and the white teacher comes up to me and says, we're going to put Jade at this table so she can be with Zimmerman, who's also African-American. And at first I was like, what? Are you segregating? I was all ready to be defensive, but I know in the back of my head, I'm like, well, she's really thinking about where my daughter may feel more comfortable. So we need to be more intentional in our exposures. Should you invite somebody to your house who's very different from your child, who you have no knowledge of, you don't speak the language of? Yes. I think what's happened in our movement toward everybody saying we're all the same, which we are not, people have been less willing to say, you know what, I'm going to have that little girl over and we're going to learn about cooking East Indian food. So really sharing and exploring difference is something that should be intentional in your school settings, in your college settings, in your friend groups. Going out of your comfort zone. Do you invite the unpopular kid who's other? Do you, I grew up with an autistic brother. Do you invite the kid who might be a little bit more troublesome to the party, but who never gets invited to a party ever? You got to look at your own family systems, schools, and communities. In your school, who gets the big parts or the parts needed for the ethnic characters? Are the kids who are supposed to be East Indian always put in the East Indian role, or the kid? So looking at sort of where is the unintentional bias that's streaming through your life and through your schools happening? Who's called on in class? Who's called on when information is needed as compared to who's called on when somebody needs to be quiet or sit still or some sort of disciplinary action? And there's studies backing up all these things that I'm saying, that children of certain socioeconomic groups, certain ethnicities, with certain disabilities, kids with ADHD, kids with autism, are sort of, I won't say picked on, but they're definitely singled out in terms of the disciplinary world. And children of color are as well, especially boys of color. Okay, next slide, please. So I love this slide. I've used it in lots of my other presentations. But so the power of microaggression lies in the invisibility to the perpetrator. So it's the person who typically finds it difficult to believe that he or she possesses any biased attitudes. And if occurrences happen repeatedly, are they really invisible to the perpetrator? Or are they excused because they seem small? I'm sure many of you who have any sort of, whether it's because you've got somebody short in your family, or you've got red hair in the family, or anything that can be sort of singled out, that's visible, that's not a big deal, that is continually commented on, that's harmful. And I think a lot of times, many of us, including myself, because my kids point out things that I say about drivers, or, many of us do these things repeatedly and think of them as micro because we're not overtly hurting anyone, but they're not micro. They're really aggression. And they're, we might call it passive aggressive, but they are things that permeate our feelings about other people. Who are you yelling at when you're driving in the car? Who are you telling to hurry up through the crosswalk? Who are you getting aggravated with because they go on and on and on with the story? What are your facial expressions? Who do you give eye contact to? All of those things are messages that are micro or overt aggressions that children, teens, and other people experience when they're the recipients, but they also learn about when they see them perpetrated on other people. Next slide. So is micro really micro, or just not aggression? So, oh, I really didn't mean it that way. Why are you so sensitive? I was just kidding. What do you mean? My best friend is X, Y, or Z. Oh, my husband's sister's adopted, so I have nothing against those people from Cambodia. So So I think a lot of microaggressions are actually socially sanctioned in the sense that if it's no big deal, then it's not seen as aggression. If you're not being pushed, hit, or overtly bullied, but they're just as harmful and they're actually more frequent and more pervasive than actual overt actions of bullying. Go ahead, please. I'll talk faster. So this slide I feel like is pretty important. So the first thing we have to do, people, how do we mitigate occurrences of microaggression? How do we stop being perpetrators? We all are perpetrators within our own families, within our communities, within our schools, because usually if we are what we consider ourselves to be good people, a lot of these things are not intentional, but we're not always aware. So the first thing is we have to choose. That word is very important. Choose to become more aware of what a microaggression is, to explore your own biases, to examine your example to others, and then to decide to learn from worthy sources and to discuss issues. So reading is a huge thing. I'm a big time reader. But these are areas that I think are prone, these subjects, these topics, these exposures are areas that are prone to what we want to call microaggression or even overt aggression. So issues related to wealth. Children who have torn clothes as compared to children who have fancy clothes. The child who comes to school with, a Gucci belt compared to the kid who ties a torn up handkerchief around their waist to hold up their pants. Ideas of beauty, light eyes, green eyes, curly hair. I love you when you're so pretty. I've heard little girls say to each other. Straight hair, curly hair, nappy hair, skin tone, clothing. If you're wearing fashionable clothes versus you have your own style versus you don't have the money to, you just wear whatever's given to you. Food. This is a big area where children of different ethnicities, I know we're talking to mostly parents who probably have children in private schools or in communities that are more resourced. But even bringing ethnic food to school sometimes is sort of something that becomes an issue for kids, and they become very afraid to take, sushi to school or certain types of beans or anything like that that identifies them as being ethnic. Language is another one. Oh, you talk white. You don't sound like you're black. Oh, I'm taking away your Asian card because you just got a D. Music preference. I remember my son played basketball at a private school. Very good basketball player, but also an excellent student. And there was a group of students who came from Sweden or some European country to play. It was a wonderful cultural exchange. And he was the only African-American kid on the team at the time. And they all just kept coming around him, asking him what rap songs he knew. And of course, he knew them just like all the white kids knew the rap songs. But it was kind of offensive over time. It's like, is that all they can think about with me is like rap? The assumptions that are made about music preference, athletic ability, rhythm. How many people, I'll raise my hand, I don't have great rhythm. I'm supposed to, but I'm okay. Intelligence. I feel so bad for many of my daughter's friends or kids' friends, who are stereotypes about Asians being smart or studious or academic success, aggressive behavior. Little black boys are always assumed to be more aggressive and always, not always, but studies have shown. So a lot of this I'm talking about is not just off the top of my head, that kids of color, African-American, Latino, any child, especially of darker skin color, is more likely to be reprimanded and punished for an action that another child may not be. So because of the assumption of aggression. Drug use, body size, sexuality. Little girls of certain ethnicities actually do go through puberty earlier physiologically and then are assumed to be sexually active way before they are, and sometimes get sexual advances from peers and from older teens when they really, really aren't ready from that and need to be protected from that. Assumptions about criminality, hostility, and anger. I don't know how many times women of color, are assumed of being angry and hostile, and you're just so mad all the time. And emotional expression. I've got this wonderful patient, the dad's Italian. He's always like, look, Dr. Richard, we're loud, we're emotional. And he'll start crying with me. And I'm like, I'm loud and emotional too. Don't worry about it. But we do have these sort of, the hard part is we don't want to make assumptions about people's cultures or their individual feelings or their aptitudes. At the same time, don't want to ignore what is cultural for them and something that they embrace. So that's kind of the hard part, is that these hot topics that I'm talking about are fraught with opportunities for microaggressive behavior. And so this is where I say, if you look at any slide, sort of examine your own life and where these things may be playing out in your own life with your children. Whose hair do you compliment? What makeup artist do you say you like? Are all the pictures on your wall of a certain type, body size, things like that? Because we each have cultural determinants and implicit biases, as well as individual differences. We're not all the same. Like I said, I was losing weight at one point at the same time I was talking about earlier, and when I'd go to my kids' basketball practice, they're like, girl, you better stop losing weight. You're going to be too skinny, and then my white friends would be like, oh my God, how much more are you going to lose? You look so great. I was like, actually, I'm done. So, that kind of thing, it wasn't hurtful to me because I'm very open and I can talk about it. But we do need to think about the things we say and believe when we're interacting with people. And most people in the US have some sort of difference from us. Go ahead. Next slide, please. So hot spots for microaggression. The classroom is a very, 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 very hotspot. Interestingly, if any of you have looked at many of these deer, like Dear Fashaw, Dear Westridge, Dear Prep, Dear Poly, Dear, I don't know if PCS has one, or Mayfield, but a lot of the schools, once Black Lives Matter protests began, started having these portals for kids to talk about their experiences in some of these predominantly mainstream, non-ethnic schools. And interestingly, a lot of these microaggressions that students talk about actually came from adults in their midst, or they came from their peers with adults present who did not mitigate. So children in these positions need support. And that's one of the things that a lot of times people say, oh, I don't want to get involved, or I don't want to say anything. But these are areas, because often the person who's the recipient of a microaggression is often in the minority. That's why it's sort of allowed to happen even. So if you are a person who's in the majority, you're not likely to have a microaggression or an overt aggression put in your way. So adults need to intervene. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about bullying. I know I have like a few more minutes. I will go through, but the classroom and the playground are huge places that if you talk to children and they go back, I tried to interview my kids again. They've all been interviewed by newspapers, actually. And I was asking them to help me with this. And they're just like, oh, they're so done with this conversation, so they wouldn't help me. But I'm remembering my daughter, who was on the softball team and went up to Lancaster. She was the only Black girl, only freshman, so vulnerable right there, only Black girl on the varsity softball team in Lancaster, and all over the dugout and the bench for the visiting team, it had the NIGGER word all over it. And she said she felt horrified and embarrassed, but nobody said anything. The coach didn't say anything, that even just to say, oh, isn't this awful? Just anything, no recognition whatsoever. I never even knew that happened to her. She's 30. She just told me about it when all this all these schools came out. My son was told in a class, everybody had to tell when their families set foot on the US soil, because we're all immigrants and we're all, and he actually reached out to his teacher and was quoted in the LA Times about this, saying that, 3 of us in your class out of 10 people, so it wasn't a huge class, cannot say when our ancestors arrived on the soil of this country because we were brought here against our will. And the teacher was very like, oh my God, I didn't even think of that. But this is, 2020. And and 2020, and he didn't think of it. So I think that adults need to really be brought up to speed. I remember the people touching my afro the most were adults when I was a kid. So parents, I know a lot of you on this call are parents. Field trips, the playground, the lunch table, play dates in friends' homes. My kids have been invited to birthday parties where everybody had to wear an afro and act. What was the word? Not ghetto, but some other word like hip hop, or I don't remember. But stereotypes. What's said on the athletic events and the sidelines. When other kids have successes, are you taking away from them and attributing that success to some external factor, whether that other than their hard work? That is one of the most hurtful things that is pervasive among parents, that I see, where, oh, this person just got into that school because they're Black, or this person made it on the team because the debate team because they're Asian, or this person, they only take the blonde haired girls for X, Y, or Z. Those things are very, very hurtful and need to be explored. Invitations, who was invited and who was not? I'd say the individuals who were the most uninvited people to anything for children, adolescents, or adults are individuals with developmental disabilities. So we're talking about kids with autism, kids with cerebral palsy, kids with intellectual disability, kids with ADHD. It may be that you need to invite the parent to come along to manage the situation, but it is the most hurtful thing ever for year after year after year for a child never to be invited to anything. And I say, look around and see who's not invited and just invite those people. Go next slide, please. So once again, do we have an obligation to intentionally seek out those who are different from ourselves? And I say yes. I say that's the only way any of this is going to change. That doesn't mean, if you find people like, wow, I've never made latkes before, and maybe this child's mom and I could make latkes together so I can learn. And another time, they come to my house to learn. I don't know. I make good Christmas cookies, whatever. But I think overt effort has to be made for us to intentionally break down some of these microaggressions, because the more we know and understand each other on a personal level, the less likely we are to see so much as different, because microaggressions are often based on difference. Go ahead, next slide, please. So a medical journal. What is the norm is the big thing here. So working to reduce racism. This is a highly regarded developmental behavioral pediatrician who I've gone to hear speak. I read her stuff all the time. I was reading an article she wrote thinking, oh, good, I found something. Here's what I found. Reducing racism requires parents and professionals to examine their prejudices and to be able to convey positive or neutral reactions to people who are different. Now, what I noticed here, I would have liked it if she'd said different from themselves, because she just said who are different. She's assuming that difference means different from white or different from male. So another quote, parents need to display curiosity, positive affect, comfort around people who are different from themselves. Yes, I like that. They do well to seek contact and friendships from other groups. So if you're being intentional about it, there's nothing wrong with that. Find other people who want to be intentional about it. When you displayed curiosity, though, this is a quote out of a medical journal I read. I'm like, curiosity. I can remember people patting my hair when I was a little kid, or wanting to, other kids look at your underarm hair to see if it's curly like, hers. Or so curiosity is a loaded word. This is a quote from a medical journal, but your curiosity needs to be very, very well informed and not kind of ignorant. And that's true for me. Now, I'm not saying it whether you're talking to anybody who's other. My kids always say, Mom, there's things I say, I have a really good Persian friend, and she's one of my best friends. And, I do double kisses with her, and I love her food, and all these things that we've embraced with each other. And her husband, she always says he wanted to be a Black man with soul, so he'll come to our house and dance. But one thing I never realized, and I realized I went to her 50th birthday party a couple months ago, and all the music was Persian. And I was in shock. Like, well, why would you be in shock, Leslie? You know, once again, it wasn't a microaggression, but it was a very biased view of everything I realized about myself. So it's not just about like what you are, who you are, what you're used to. It's really going out of your own comfort zone. So I even told her, I never imagined you guys, I said, you guys dance to Persian music. Now they do all like the soul brother moves to Persian music. So that was something new and I enjoyed it and I had a great time. But my point is that curiosity is a good thing as long as it's not sort of stereotypical curiosity. And as long as it's an embracing and not sort of a like, oh, let me see how you guys eat, but I think the more we interact with each other intentionally, our microaggressions and our biases will diminish. Next slide. So really quickly, social interpretations develop at a very early age. So newborns will see a parent or another person with, let's say, orange hair where their hair is usually black, or a hat on that they don't recognize, and they will scream and cry. Humans are made to recognize difference for survival. That's something that, if you do any biology. So difference is not a bad thing. Infants notice skin color, because it's a stable feature of their parents. Next slide, please. So assigning value to these differences is the problem. So social interpretations are cued from parents' feelings and reactions. Oh, that kid only got in because she's Black. Oh, that one got on the team because all Asian kids are good at ping pong. We naturally transmit our own biases and experiences. So what is other? What do we mean by other? My daughter, who went to Spain, who I told you about before, she wrote in her college essay that she, for the first time in her life, felt like she was just a person. And it wasn't because they didn't see that she was Black. They called her the little negrita. She didn't mind that. It was like a term of endearment, but it didn't mean she liked rap music. It didn't mean she knew how to dance Soul Brother. It didn't mean that she wasn't a good student. And that's the thing that she felt so different here. It's like here in the US, especially, we all sort of go with what the cultural norm is of what standards are of beauty, and of value. And the value is based, unfortunately, very much on Nordic looking, honestly, males. And I don't even know, sometimes I can't decide if gender trumps race, but they're both things that really are often assigned value. And so thinking to yourself, what is other? Are you other? Am I other? What are we talking about is normative for this country? And I think that's a hard thing to answer at this time. Next slide, please. So the developmental effect of maltreatment. So children 3 years old and above really value fairness. They can tell if someone's being treated nicely or not nicely, and they fear those who are mean or not fair. They fear if someone like them is being mistreated. So you don't, and I remember this about one of my children who was very shy. If she saw another kid get in trouble, she would hardly move because she felt like, well, if that happened to them, that could happen to me. So mistreatment, or microaggressions, as we're calling them, on the playground, on the play date, at the birthday party, they do not only negatively affect the individual who's experiencing it, but they create an environment of fear for everyone there. By age 4.5, most children can consider another's point of view if it's shaped by an adult. So older children and teens need to be taught some empathy. How would you feel what if you were expelled from school for chewing one piece of gum? What if it were your sister? How would you, in the world, would it be if everyone got to go to college? Mental exercises are excellent ways of expanding children's thinking. First of all, though, you got to expand your own thinking and the conversations you have in your home with your children. Next slide.
Hey, Leslie.
Yes.
It's Noemi. I know we have a couple of more slides to go, and a few of them are really interesting. We have a couple of questions.
Okay,
so
sure.
I want to leave some time to let people
Okay.
get their questions.
Okay. So, all right. All right. I will just say this, and then we'll have our questions. Microaggressions are not always micro. And when they happen to someone over and over and over in their life, they become traumatic experiences and can affect their health, their mental health, and their well-being lifelong. It's really a form of bullying that is occurring here. And bullying has been studied extensively and is known to have lifelong effects on children, adults, and adolescents. I'm sure I'll answer your other questions in the rest of the slides. So go ahead and ask questions.
Okay, so one of the questions that came through was, hold on, let me pull it up for you. Can you explain how anti-Black racism defines the racial caste system in America and throughout the world, and that in many cultures that have been colonized, the darkest people are always the most oppressed?
Boy, that is a heavy one. And that is one I've actually done a lot of learning about more in my college years. So you can look at this at in very different perspectives. The first thing is, so you can look at it from a sort of what we call eugenics standpoint. So looking at genetics and basically, and I'm going to ask you to repeat the question again, but I'm going to answer this part. Skin color is a biological phenomenon based on sun exposure and closeness or further or distance from the equator. So genetically, over millions of years, humans have evolved into being different, colors. Now, whether or not those colors have been ascribed to have different value, I think came later. But what's happened is, over time, both class and caste systems have been developed when there's the ability to differentiate people based on some external factor. And that's what race has become. Ask the question, give me a little more of the question, though. I feel like there's
and so sure. And the second part is just that, and that in many cultures that have been colonized, the darkest peoples are almost always oppressed.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of interesting conversation about this. There's a very interesting book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Ivan van Sertima. I read it back in the 70s or 80s. But basically, if you look at migration and how the assumption, I was a human biology major, so the assumption was that, civilization started on the continent of Africa, and that individuals migrated away. So the original people were darker skinned just because they were near the equator. And over time, through migration, developed lighter skin based on a whole lot of issues related to melanin, sun exposure. And what started having to happen is people had to start differentiating between each other in order for survival. And survival was easier in more equatorial places. Food was more abundant, water was more abundant. So when people started migrating away, life got harder. If you think about Nordic places, the ice, so I think people went out from Africa and from equatorial regions and decided that they needed to conquer what was there already. And often those more indigenous peoples were of darker skin. So, this is a very good question. It's like something to study. Actually, my mother studied this quite a bit with a very famous historian by the name of Asa Hilliard. And so whoever asked this question, I can give you a lot of information about it.
We
A lot of
can
it
give
has
you, yeah, we can
what?
give you that point of we can give you that
Okay.
point of contact, Leslie. There was another
Okay.
question about this is another large question. How does white supremacy impact the assigning of value?
Oh my God. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's a
that's
difficult.
like, well, basically you have to, okay, so basically you have to really think about the word supremacy, okay? Supremacy means of higher value, of higher worth, of everything that's better, to be supreme. It also implies power over, okay? So, I mean, if you think about God, you know, we talk about God being the supreme being. So we're saying that a class, a race of people is somehow inherently, this is what white supremacy believes, is inherently superior genetically, intellectually, and therefore somehow more entitled to all of the goods that belong on this earth, not just in the US, but on the earth. So whether it's the best water, the best land, the best gold, the best mines, the best mountains, the best water, whether there's freedom to live freely or live in poverty, whether there's freedom to persecute other peoples for personal gain. So white supremacy is damaging not only to all people who are not white, it's damaging to white people. You know, and the fact that we're seeing such a resurgence of it now, I think, you know, my major in college was human biology, and this whole fear, I think, of genetics and people's feeling like their genetics are being threatened. So, you know, there's a whole movement that if there's too much intermingling or intermixing of the races, there will no longer be the white race. So in order to sort of, some people believe, this is what we call eugenics, that what that's about is sort of like keeping a pure race so that it will not be obliterated, or there's a fear of that. And so in order to divert or avert that occurrence, some groups of people feel like they need to have control of the goods, everything that's good and available and present, because they are inherently superior to everyone else based on their race.
Yep. So Leslie, I was going to have Kelly, if you could take us to slide 28. So Dr. Richard, if you could walk us through the slide on the kind of help, since we just have about 10 more minutes left.
Okay. Okay.
And then we could go from here, because I think this really gets into some of the meat of what you wanted to share earlier.
Yes. So when you have your children either be recipients or kind of perpetrators of this, you know, sometimes our children are, it's not that they're being mean, they just aren't aware, they're not exposed, they don't know how to say, you know, why does that kid look funny, or why is he flapping his hands in his face, or why is her hair poofy. But one thing is whether or not you should get involved. So the first thing, because this is just, I had some other slides before this, is yes, what we've seen with bullying and overt bullying is that adults need to get involved to support children who are experiencing bullying. Both the bully and the bullied need to be supported by the school. The parents need to go to the school and ask the school for help, and whoever, most schools have programs. It is not recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics or other psychologists that parents try to work out these things with each other, because all of us are going to be mama bear, daddy bear, and want to protect our own children. But helping our children to problem solve along with our support is very important. So coping skills and emotional regulation skills are necessary for dealing with microaggressions or overt aggression. So the first thing is you want to teach your children to use sort of an acronym, IDEAL, and you guys can learn this yourselves and then teach them that first, being able to identify the feelings and the situation for each person involved. So, you know, the kid who says you can't play, how does it feel? Why is the child who's saying you can't play saying that? But how does it feel for the child who's the recipient of that? Then you want to think about developing several solutions that might solve the problem. Not just one solution, not just give the ball to her, give the ball to him, but okay, how can we work this out? Then you want to evaluate the pros and the cons of each solution. Well, if we give the ball to this person, then this might happen. If we choose not to play at all, then this might happen. If we give the ball to somebody else not even involved between the two of you, then this might happen. So looking at the pros and cons of what your solutions may be, and then to act and choose one solution to implement, usually with the agreement, not snatching the toy from one kid, throwing it to the other and say, here, it's your turn, but really saying, you know, choosing to implement a solution and then learning from the experience. Now, my add to this, and I got this from an American Academy of Pediatrics thing I'm involved in, but is to circle back again, you know, to kind of, because a lot of times I think adults assume, because I'm a developmental behavioral pediatrician, so I talk to individuals a lot. And I think a lot of times parents and educators assume that a problem has been solved where a child is still really suffering from its effects and the adults don't know. So I think that's really important. Okay.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, Leslie, that's going to lead into, we have a couple of more questions that were up there.
Okay.
So one is, these are kind of interrelated. So how do I help my children seek out those who are from different backgrounds when we're in a predominantly white area? And then if my children are one of the few interracial or non-white kids in a school, can exposure to movies, books help with understanding microaggressions?
Yes, to all of those questions. So the first thing is, I think one of the first things is just finding like-minded parents. That doesn't mean they need to be like you, but just, you know, I've had people, you know, my son loves some little bird eggs that one of his little friends' mother used to send, you know, and I was like, where do you get those? You know, we started talking about whatever kind of specific market that she went to. So if you have anybody who just seems friendly, invite somebody over. You know, be a good neighbor, that kind of thing. If you're gonna find like-minded people. Like if there's a list of this conversation, okay, and anybody knows each other or anybody who's part of this organization, you know, I think food is a wonderful way to learn about other people and share things. You know, one of the schools my kids went to that I thought was great is we have what we call these hosted dinners. You could get a group of people kind of informally. The school doesn't have to do it. That just says, okay, well, now with COVID, okay, this is like, maybe we have to do this differently, but this is an idea of people who would not necessarily interact with each other. You know, and having what are they called? You know, a dinner, you know, a hosted dinner. You go to one person's house for, you know, a caravan dinner, or where you go to one person's house and they serve their traditional food and you talk about the culture. The thing is not being afraid to say that you want to learn is really important, I think. I think we're also afraid of even bringing things up that it may appear to be racist or, you know, like if, you know, oh, you noticed I'm Black? Like, really? Yeah.
Well, actually, Leslie, I have a couple of more questions to kind of focus in on that. So one is just, there was, and maybe you can give us some examples that we can post later, but they were specifically asking for any programs that you may be aware of that might help with cultural exposure in rural areas. So for whoever asked that question, we'll make sure that we have that information available when we post the webinar. But the other question is, how do you how would you recommend that we engage with our preschool or elementary age children to learn what microaggressions they may be experiencing when we aren't present? And so one of those is kind of specifically related to, how are microaggressions coming across in Zoom with distance learning? What should we be on the lookout for? And how can these be recognized and dealt with, not only by our children, but by their teacher, and what they don't know about other students? And so one of the comments was, folks didn't know that somebody was African-American. They thought they were white based on the way they spoke. And then they felt like there was a shift in communication when they found out that they were African American. So they're saying they can assume that that same thing might be true for their children. So I think,
Right.
yeah, so I think
Right.
maybe speaking, since we might be in COVID for a little while longer, maybe speaking to that via COVID.
Well, one thing first I would say is I really believe in books. Now, call me a nerd, whatever. But, there are so many good books for children because it's hard to have these conversations. Like, if your child comes home, was anybody mean to you? Did anybody call your name? But books that help give perspective taking, as we call it. So, there are so many. That are, you can look at lists now on Amazon, um, books first that help sort of build the self-image and self-esteem of the child who's reading it. So, so and so has big hair, or so and so has freckles, or but then also understanding, so and so's in a wheelchair. There are so many great books. The issue is not handing your child a book, it's having a discussion about the issues that you're reading in the book. You can get through one page. So that's one thing. Being open with teachers, I think, is okay. I think teachers and educators are probably one of the groups I think really could use the most intervention in this area. Not because there's just so much to be aware of, and there's so much now. So I think that if that child felt that they were being communicated with differently, once the teacher discovered that they were not white, that needs to be brought up with the teacher, but don't put the child up to it. I think the thing that a lot of, yes, we want our children to solve their own problems with their peers, but it's very hard to put a child up against an adult when there's an issue that the child cannot change. So it's one thing if you say to your kid, talk to your teacher because she wants you to sit still. Okay, fine, sit still. But if the child is feeling like the teacher no longer calls on them anymore once they discovered that they were whatever, or they're in trouble all the time more, that is not an equal playing field, not because it's a teacher and a student, but because it's an adult and a child. And that's true for adolescents. So a lot of, it's not that, what's really hard is we want to teach our kids problem solving, like the slide shows, but we also want to have what we call scaffolding for them. So they know that we're there, and kind of help guide them in a situation where the power differential is huge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Leslie, this has been, or Dr. Richard, this has been a tremendous conversation. Unfortunately, we're reaching our 8:30 time limit. And
Okay.
so I wanted all the participants to know we do have your email address. We do have a recording of this webinar. We'll make all the slides available to you. And for those who asked questions and felt like your questions weren't addressed, we'll make sure we respond to those when we send out the information. And so,
And it would be great if any questions that I didn't fully answer, give them back to me and I can do some more research for the person, because this probably just wasn't a long enough time to, answer all the questions.
yes, and it's such a great topic and one that is of great need in our community, as you can see. So, Kelly, do you want to take it to the last, or would you like for me to share my screen? So just again, what I said earlier, we'd love for you to follow us on social media and share some of your experiences. You heard a lot tonight from Leslie, and we would love to hear some of your stories. So you could share those with us on Facebook, on Instagram. You can also go to our webpage. And of course, we want to continue to provide these types of webinars and other information in the future, especially for our Youth Ambassadors program. So we'd really encourage you to donate. This is a great cause. And we have two other things that I wanted to just report on. Next slide, Kelly. That our next outing, as we mentioned, we are doing a variety of things. We will have an outing at the Pasadena Playhouse. So this is just a little flyer on that. You can see more about this on our Instagram or Facebook page. And then lastly, just wanted to let you know that we will reach out to you. If you are a winner of one of the raffles, you will be winning a Mari face mask, and we will be contacting you directly and sending those to you. So thank you all very much for participating in the webinar. We would love to receive your feedback and hear from you directly about other topics that you might want to hear about in the future, or other things that we'd want to share in the community, because I believe everyone who is here tonight, we're all mothers, friends, parents, educators against racism and injustice. And that's how we want to continue to move forward. So thank you, Dr. Richard, for participating in this webinar. We greatly appreciate your knowledge, and thank you everyone for being here with us.
And thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.